On a green island in the middle of the sea, 3,500 years ago, there stood a palace so vast and so bewildering in its endless winding halls and staircases and storerooms that the Greeks who came long after remembered it in awe as a labyrinth, a maze so cunning that a man could be lost in it forever. And at the heart of that maze, they said, there lurked a monster, half man and half bull, to whom young men and women were sent as sacrifice, and from which no one ever returned. It is one of the most famous legends in the world, the Labyrinth, the Minotaur, the hero who slew it and found his way out by a thread. But behind that myth lies something far more astonishing and far more real. A true lost civilization, the very first great civilization of Europe, that ruled the sea and built the palaces that became the Labyrinth of legend, and that then, at the height of its glory, was shattered by one of the most violent natural catastrophes in all of human history, and vanished, leaving only its ruins and the myths that half remembered it. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, let me take you gently back to that lost island world, to the ancient Minoans, the sea kings of Crete, the forgotten founders of European civilization, whose real story is stranger and more wonderful than any legend. Come with me, slowly, across the wine-dark sea, and back 3,500 years, to the age when their painted palaces blazed with life. Picture a great island in a warm blue sea, Crete, long and mountainous, ringed with harbors, green with olive and vine. And upon it, rising among the hills, a palace like nothing the world had yet seen. A sprawling complex of hundreds of rooms about a great central court, its walls painted with brilliant scenes of leaping dolphins and gathered lilies and young people vaulting over the horns of charging bulls. For the Minoans were, above all, a people in love with life and color and beauty. Where other early civilizations covered their walls with grim kings and marching armies, the Minoans painted the sea and the flowers, the dance and the games, the sheer joy of a bright world. They were the first great civilization of Europe, and one of the most graceful and mysterious that the world has ever known. Tonight we will walk through all of it slowly, from the very beginning to the very end. We will wander the winding halls of the great palace at Knossos, and understand at last how it became the Labyrinth of legend. We will stand in rooms glowing with the most beautiful paintings of the ancient world, and watch the young leapers somersault over the backs of the bulls. We will sail with the Minoan ships across the whole Aegean and beyond, to Egypt and the coasts of Asia, for these were the first great sea power of Europe, ruling the waves so completely that their island cities, alone in that dangerous age, needed no walls at all. We will hold their exquisite golden jewels and their painted cups, and puzzle over their writing, which we still, to this day, cannot read. And then we will come to the great catastrophe, for on a nearby island there stood a mountain that was also a volcano, and one day it erupted with a violence almost beyond imagining, blasting the island apart, darkening the sky, and sending a great wave rolling across the sea toward the Minoan shores. It was, some believe, the true event that lies behind the legend of Atlantis, the great and happy island civilization swallowed by the sea. We will watch gently as the Minoan world reeled from that blow and weakened, and at last passed away. Its palaces burned, its ships gone, its sea empire inherited by others, its people fading into the mists of a new age. And we will see how the Greeks who came after kept only a broken memory of them, woven into the shimmering myths of King Minos and the Labyrinth and the monster at its heart. And we will end with the wonder of their rediscovery, for the Minoans were forgotten so completely that for thousands of years they were thought to be mere legend, until, just over a century ago, an archaeologist dug into a hillside on Crete and uncovered the labyrinth itself, and gave back to the world a whole brilliant civilization that no one had known was there. It is a story with a myth at one end and a buried palace at the other. A story of a bright, sea-loving, art-making people who built the first great civilization of Europe on a beautiful island, ruled the waves, and were struck down by the fire of the earth itself, and remembered, ever after, only as a legend of a maze and a monster and a lost world beneath the waves. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment and tell me the name of your town and what time it is where you are as you settle in. There is something quietly lovely in knowing that all around the world, others are lying in the dark, listening to this same old story under so many different skies. And if you would like to drift off like this again tomorrow night, you might gently tap subscribe. That way, each new story will quietly find its own way to you in the dark, without your ever having to go searching for it. But only if these journeys truly bring you rest. There is no need otherwise. Your peace tonight matters far more than any number. So there is nothing left to do now but let the day go. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the warmth settle into your hands and your jaw and the space behind your eyes. You do not have to remember any of this. You only have to listen and let the words carry you. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the room drift away. Feel the warm evening air of the island coming in off the sea, the smell of salt and wild thyme and olive wood smoke, the last light going golden over the painted walls and the quiet harbors, the little waves lapping in the dark. We are going back now. Far back. Past Greece, past the myths, to a green island in a bright blue sea at the very dawn of Europe, to the first small farming villages among the olives, and the slow and patient beginning of the lost world of the Minoans. Let us begin as their whole world began with the island. Picture Crete, long and narrow, stretching from east to west across the wine-dark sea at the very southern edge of what would one day be called Europe. It is a land of great contrasts, a spine of high mountains running its whole length, snow-capped in winter, and below them green valleys and fertile plains, and a coast broken into 100 sheltered bays and harbors. It was and is a beautiful place, a warm land of olive groves and vineyards, of wild herbs scenting the hillsides, of pine and cypress on the slopes and the endless blue of the sea on every side. The sun is generous here. The winters are mild. The sea is close wherever you stand. It was a land made to be loved, and the people who grew up upon it made a civilization as bright and warm as the island itself. And its position was everything. For Crete lies in the heart of the eastern Mediterranean, set like a stepping stone between three worlds, the lands of Greece and the Aegean islands to the north, the great and ancient civilization of Egypt to the south, and the rich coasts of Asia to the east. A people who learned to sail from Crete could reach them all, and grow rich as the great crossroads and carriers of the whole eastern sea. But that lay in the future. In the beginning, the sea was as much a wall as a road, a great protecting moat that set the island apart and kept it safe. For while the peoples of the mainland warred and raided across their open borders, Crete lay secure behind its ring of blue water, free to grow and to flourish in a peace that the mainland could only dream of. And the island gave its people all they needed to prosper. The famous trinity of the Mediterranean grew there in abundance: the grain in the plains, the olive on the hillsides, the vine on the slopes, giving bread and oil and wine. There were sheep and goats on the mountains, giving wool and milk and cheese. There was timber on the heights, and good clay for pottery, and the sea itself, thick with fish, lapping at every shore. It was a land, in short, that could feed a great population and support a rich and settled life, and that, being an island, could do so in safety. All that was needed was a people clever enough and patient enough to draw out its gifts. And such a people, over long, slow ages, were already taking shape upon its shores. For human beings had lived on Crete for thousands of years before the palaces rose, since the first daring settlers had crossed the sea to reach it, long ages before, bringing their seeds and their flocks to the empty green island. Slowly, over the centuries, they multiplied and spread across the land, and built their villages, and learned the deep arts of the farmer and the herder and the potter. And as the generations passed, these island villages grew, and grew richer and began to trade with one another, and then, daringly, across the water with the wider world. Cretan goods began to travel. Foreign goods and foreign ideas began to arrive, and the island, safe behind its sea, began to gather to itself the wealth and the skill and the knowledge out of which a great civilization would, in time, be born. We call that civilization Minoan, though that is a name we gave them long afterward from the legendary King Minos of the Greek myths. What they called themselves we do not know. Their own writing keeps its silence. But Minoan they have become, the people of Crete in the great age of the palaces, the first bright civilization of the European world. And before the palaces and before the greatness, there were only those first villages among the olives, the patient farmers and fishers and potters who never dreamed what they were beginning. To that quiet beginning, and to the slow rise out of it toward the age of the great palaces, we now will go. Long before the great palaces, then, Crete was a land of villages, small settlements of mud brick and stone scattered across the fertile plains and along the sheltered coasts, their people living the quiet, ancient life of the Mediterranean farmer. They grew their grain and tended their olives and vines, herded their sheep and goats, fished the teeming sea, and shaped the good island clay into pots upon the wheel. And they were skilled, these early islanders, and growing more so with every generation. Their pottery grew finer and more beautiful. They learned to work stone into elegant vessels, and to fashion tiny, exquisite seals of ivory and stone, carved with little images of animals and patterns. And they learned, above all, to work metal, copper, and then bronze, for the great age that was dawning across the whole of that world was the age of bronze. For this was the Bronze Age, the age when human beings first learned to mix copper with a little tin to make bronze, a metal hard enough for real tools and weapons, and the foundation of the first true civilizations. And bronze, being made of metals that were rare and often far apart, could only be had through trade, long-distance trade, across the sea. And so the Bronze Age was, from its very beginning, an age of ships and of the peoples who could sail them. Here Crete's moment came. For the islanders, set in the heart of the sea, were perfectly placed to become the carriers and the traders of that new bronze world, to fetch the copper and the tin, to gather the goods of many lands, and to grow rich as the middlemen of the eastern Mediterranean. And as the wealth of trade flowed in, the old equal villages began to change, and to grow, and to reach towards something greater. Certain settlements, better placed or better led, grew into real towns, gathering people and wealth and skill. And within them, a new thing appeared, leaders and the rich and the powerful men and women who commanded the trade and the surplus, who organized the labor of many, and who began to want and to build a fitting center for their growing power. The seeds of the palaces were being sown. And then, quite suddenly in the long, slow story of the island, it happened. Across Crete, at a handful of the greatest centers, the people began to build on a wholly new scale, raising, around a great central courtyard, sprawling complexes of hundreds of rooms, storerooms and workshops, shrines and halls, and the dwellings of the powerful. The first palaces had risen. The age of Minoan greatness had begun. We are not certain, even now, exactly what these palaces were, or how the society that built them was ruled. Perhaps by kings, perhaps by priest rulers, perhaps by powerful families or councils. But whatever the truth, the palaces were plainly the beating hearts of the Minoan world, the centers of its government, its religion, its craft, its trade, and its wealth, gathering the life of a whole region into themselves. For a palace was far more than a grand house. It was a vast storehouse, its great magazines lined with enormous jars holding the oil and wine and grain of the whole surrounding land, gathered in and redistributed. It was a workshop, humming with the labor of potters and smiths and weavers and seal cutters. It was a shrine where the rites of the gods were kept. It was the engine that drove and organized and enriched the entire Minoan world. And they were beautiful, for the Minoans, unlike so many, built not only for power but for grace and light and pleasure. Their palaces were open and airy, full of courtyards and light wells and columned porches, their walls glowing with brilliant paintings, their staircases and terraces looking out over the sea. To live in a Minoan palace, it seems, was to live surrounded by color and beauty and the light of the island's sun. Of all these palaces, one stood above the rest, the greatest and most famous of them all. The palace of Knossos, rising on its low hill near the northern coast, the very heart of the Minoan world, and the palace whose vast and winding complexity would, long ages later, be remembered by the Greeks as the Labyrinth itself. To Knossos and to the wonder of the Minoan palace we now will go. Come, then, and let us approach the great palace of Knossos, as a Minoan of 3,500 years ago might have approached it, walking up from the harbor town through the busy streets, and coming at last to the vast, sprawling, many-storied complex that was the beating heart of the whole island world. It is enormous, a great rambling structure covering acres of ground, hundreds upon hundreds of rooms rising in places 3 or 4 stories high, all built around one great central court, paved and open to the sky. There is no single grand gateway, no towering facade meant to overawe. Instead, the palace spreads and rambles, wing upon wing, level upon level, added to and rebuilt over the generations. A whole small city gathered under one vast and complicated roof. Step inside, and you enter a world of shifting light and shade. Corridors turn and wind, staircases climb and descend, rooms open into rooms, light wells drop down through the stories to bring sun and air into the heart of the building. Everywhere are the distinctive Minoan columns, smooth and painted a brilliant red, and, most curiously, tapering downward, broader at the top than at the base, like nothing else in the ancient world. The great central court lay at the very heart of it all, a broad paved rectangle open to the sky, around which the whole vast palace was arranged. Here, perhaps, the great ceremonies were held and the crowds gathered. Here, some believe, the famous games with the bulls were played, in the very center of the Minoan world, beneath the windows and terraces of the watching palace. Around the court, the palace unfolded in its bewildering variety. On one side lay the great staterooms and shrines and halls of ceremony. On another, the royal apartments, with their fine bathrooms and their light wells and their painted walls. Below and behind lay the vast storerooms. Elsewhere, the workshops, the archives, the quarters of the many who lived and worked within. It was a world in itself, endlessly complex, endlessly interconnected. And it was a marvel of comfort and cleverness. The Minoans were master builders and engineers. Their palaces had light wells to bring sun deep into the building, and clever systems of drains and clay pipes to carry water in and waste away. Even in the royal apartments of Knossos, what may be among the earliest flushing toilets in the world. They understood how to make a great building airy and light and pleasant to live in, as few peoples of that age did. Above all, the palace was alive with color. Its walls, within and without, were covered with the famous Minoan frescoes, brilliant paintings on wet plaster, glowing with reds and blues and golds, of processions and ceremonies, of leaping dolphins and gathered flowers, of elegant women in their finery and young men bearing gifts, and everywhere the sacred charging bulls. To walk through Knossos was to walk through a gallery of the most joyful art the ancient world ever made. Imagine it, then, in its living glory, the red columns glowing, the painted walls blazing with color, the great court full of people, the sunlight falling through the light wells, the sea glittering beyond the terraces, the smell of the storerooms and the workshops in the sea, the whole vast complex humming with the life of the island's heart. It was a place of astonishing sophistication and beauty 3,500 years ago. And it was not alone. Across Crete rose other great palaces, at Phaistos in the south, looking out over its fertile plain, at Malea along the northern coast, at Zakros in the far east, close by its harbor. Each was the heart of its own region, and each shared the same brilliant style, the central court, the red columns, the storerooms, the frescoes, the grace and the light. But Knossos was the greatest of them all, and its story is, above all, the story of the Minoans. We do not know for certain who ruled from Knossos, whether a king, a queen, a priest ruler, or a powerful family. The Minoans left us no great royal tombs heaped with a conqueror's treasure, no boastful inscriptions of a king's victories, no towering statues of a ruler. Whoever held power here held it, it seems, in a manner different from the god-kings of Egypt or the warlords of the mainland, and their true nature remains one of the many quiet mysteries of the Minoan world. But of all the mysteries of Knossos, the deepest and most famous is this: how a real palace on a real island came to be remembered across 1,000 years as the Labyrinth of legend, the endless maze that held the monster at its heart. And the answer lies in the very nature of the great palace itself. Let us step, then, into the labyrinth and see how the myth was born. To understand how the palace became the labyrinth, you have only to try to find your way through it. For Knossos was, quite simply, one of the most complicated buildings ever raised in the ancient world. A vast, rambling, many-leveled maze of hundreds of interconnected rooms, added to and rebuilt across the centuries with no simple plan and no clear way through. Picture a stranger set down within it for the first time. Corridors branch and turn back on themselves. Staircases rise to upper floors and drop to lower ones. Rooms open into other rooms, and those into others still. Light wells and blank walls confuse the sense of direction. The sea is now on this side, now on that, and everywhere the endless variety of chambers looks, to the lost visitor, bewilderingly the same. A person unfamiliar with Knossos might well wander it for a long time before finding the way out. Now imagine the tales carried home by the Greeks of the mainland in later ages, who heard of this vast and winding palace of the sea kings, or saw its ruins, or remembered it dimly in their stories. A building of 1,000 rooms, in which a man might lose himself utterly. What was that, to their imagination, but a labyrinth? A maze built with deliberate cunning, so intricate that no one who entered it could ever find their way out again? And there may be more to it even than the winding halls. For the very symbol of the Minoan palace, carved and painted throughout Knossos, was the double axe, a sacred emblem, an axe with two blades, appearing again and again upon the walls and the pillars. And the word the Greeks used for the maze, labyrinth, may itself descend from an old word meaning the house of the double axe. The palace of the double axe became, in Greek mouths, the labyrinth, the very name preserving the memory of the Minoan shrine. And then there is the monster at the labyrinth's heart, the Minotaur, the fearful being with the body of a man and the head of a bull, to whom, the legend says, young Greeks were sent as sacrifice. And here, too, the myth reaches back to something real. For the bull, as we shall see, stood at the very center of Minoan religion and Minoan life, its horns and its image everywhere in the palace, its great games played, perhaps, in the central court itself. Imagine a mainland Greek, hearing of the sea kings of Crete who ruled the waves and demanded tribute, of their vast and maze-like palace, of the sacred bull whose image filled it, and the games in which young people faced the charging beast in the great court. Blend these together in the memory of the centuries, and you have, almost ready-made, the legend. The tyrant King Minos, the Labyrinth, and the man-bull monster to whom the young were fed. And the storerooms deepen the sense of the maze. For a great part of the palace was given over to storage. Long, narrow magazines, room after room, lined with rows of enormous clay jars, taller than a person, in which the wealth of the whole land was kept. The olive oil, the wine, the grain. To wander these endless rows of great jars, in the dim light, was itself to move through a kind of maze, heavy with the treasure of the sea kings. For the palace, remember, was above all a great engine of gathering and storing and sharing out. The produce of the whole surrounding land flowed into these magazines, was recorded by the palace scribes, and was redistributed, to feed the workers, to supply the craftsmen, to provision the ships, to trade abroad. In those endless storerooms lay the real secret of the palace's power, the wealth of a whole island, gathered into one winding, labyrinthine heart. And so the labyrinth of legend was, in truth, no fantasy at all, but a real and remembered thing. The vast, winding, bewildering, treasure-filled palace of Knossos, home of the sea kings and the sacred bull, dimly recalled across the centuries and transformed, by the storytelling genius of the Greeks, into one of the most enduring myths the world has ever known. There is something wonderful in that, to stand in the real ruins of Knossos, and to feel the myth and the history become one. To know that the labyrinth was a real place, that a person could really lose their way in it, that the bull and the double axe were really there, and that behind the shimmering legend of Minos and the Minotaur lies the solid, sunlit stone of an actual lost civilization. But the Minoans were far more than the makers of a maze. Their true greatness lay not in the palace alone, but in what the palace made possible. For from these winding halls, the sea kings of Crete reached out and mastered the whole of the surrounding sea, and built the first great maritime power in the history of Europe. To the Minoans as masters of the sea we now will turn. The Minoans were, before all else, a people of the sea. Set upon their island, ringed by blue water on every side, they turned to the sea as naturally as breathing, and they became the first people of Europe to master it, and to build their whole greatness upon it. The later Greeks even had a word for what the Minoans achieved: a thalassocracy, a rule of the sea, an empire not of land but of ships and trade and the open water. Picture the Minoan ships setting out from the harbors of Crete, graceful vessels driven by sail and oar, high-prowed, cutting across the blue Aegean toward the scattered islands and distant coasts. In their pictures, painted on their walls and carved on their little seals, we glimpse whole fleets of them, sails set, dolphins leaping alongside, bound out across the sea that was, to the Minoans, not a barrier but a broad and glittering highway. And they sailed everywhere. North to the islands of the Aegean and the shores of the Greek mainland, east to the rich coasts of Asia and the island of Cyprus with its copper, south across the open sea to mighty Egypt itself. Wherever they went, they carried the fine goods of Crete, the beautiful pottery, the worked metal, the oil and the wine, and brought home the treasures of the world: gold and ivory, copper and tin, precious stones and exotic wonders. So completely did the Minoans come to dominate the Aegean Sea that their influence spread far beyond their own island. on the scattered islands of the Aegean, and even on the coasts of the mainland, we find Minoan goods, Minoan art, Minoan ways, whole settlements that look, in their pottery and their paintings and their manners, thoroughly Minoan. Whether by trade, by settlement, or by something like empire, the culture of Crete came to rule the whole surrounding sea. And here we come to the most telling fact of all, the one that reveals, more than any other, the peculiar character of the Minoan world. For their cities, alone among the great powers of that violent age, had no walls. Across the mainland, every town of any size huddled behind mighty fortifications, in constant dread of the raider and the enemy. But the Minoan towns lay open to the land, unwalled and unafraid. Think what that means. It means that the Minoans did not fear attack, that they felt safe, secure, at peace, in an age when almost no one else did. And the reason was the sea and their mastery of it. For their ships were their walls. Their fleet ruled the water that ringed their island, and no enemy could reach the unwalled towns of Crete without first defeating the navy that guarded the sea. The Minoans lived behind a moat 100 miles wide, patrolled by their own ships. And so they lived, it seems, in a long and remarkable peace, a peace that shaped their whole civilization and made it different from all the others of its age. Freed from the constant fear of war, they poured their genius not into fortifications and weapons and the glorification of conquest, but into beauty and comfort and the arts of peace, into their painted palaces, their brilliant frescoes, their exquisite crafts, their sheer joyful celebration of the living world. It is one of the loveliest things about them, and one of the rarest in all of history, a great civilization built not on war but on trade, not on fear but on the confidence of the sea, that spent its wealth and its genius on making life beautiful rather than on making war. Whether they were truly as peaceful as they seem, we cannot be perfectly sure, but the open, unwalled, art-loving world they left behind speaks powerfully of a people at peace. And that peace, and that wealth, and that mastery of the sea gave the Minoans the freedom to become what they are most loved for being, the great artists of the ancient world. For with their cities safe and their storerooms full and their ships bringing home the riches of 3 continents, they turned their island genius to the making of beautiful things, and made some of the most joyful and enchanting art that human hands have ever produced. To that art, to the glowing frescoes and the exquisite pottery and the whole bright, life-loving beauty of the Minoan world, we now will turn. For if you wish to understand these people and to love them, you have only to look at what they painted on their walls. Not gods and kings and battles, but the sea and the flowers and the dance and the sheer delight of being alive on a beautiful island in the sun. If there is one thing that sets the Minoans apart from every other civilization of their age, it is their art, and above all their frescoes, the brilliant paintings with which they covered the walls of their palaces and their homes. For where other ancient peoples painted their walls with the grim business of power, the Minoans painted joy, the beauty of the natural world, and the delight of being alive in it. Their frescoes were painted on wet plaster, so that the color sank into the wall and became part of it, glowing and permanent. And they glow still, 3,500 years later, with an astonishing freshness and life. Brilliant blues and reds, warm yellows and greens, the colors of the sea and the flowers and the island sun, fresh as the day they were laid down. And look at what they chose to paint. Dolphins, curving and leaping through a blue sea thick with fish. Lilies and crocuses and roses, springing in glorious profusion across the walls. Blue monkeys clambering among the rocks, birds among the branches, a partridge, a hoopoe, a swallow in flight. The Minoans looked at the living world of their island and loved it, and set it down upon their walls with a freshness and a joy that no other ancient art can quite match. And they painted people, but not, for the most part, as grim rulers or marching soldiers. They painted elegant women in flounced skirts and open bodices, with elaborate curling hair and dark shining eyes, at ceremonies and gatherings, chatting and watching, so lifelike and so full of personality that one famous fresco of a court lady has been nicknamed, ever since, the Little Parisian. They painted young men, slender and graceful, bearing offerings or vaulting over bulls. There is a lightness, a grace, an easy naturalism to Minoan painting that feels almost modern. The figures move, the animals live, the flowers sway, the sea ripples. Where Egyptian art is grand and stiff and eternal, Minoan art is quick and fresh and alive, caught, as it were, in a passing moment of the living world, full of movement and color and delight. It is the art of a people who found the world beautiful and wished to celebrate it. Consider one of their most famous images: a slender young man, crowned with lilies and peacock feathers, walking through a field of flowers, the so-called Prince of the Lilies. Or a fresco of dolphins arching through the sea above the doorways of a queen's chamber. Or the ladies of the court, seated and gossiping in their finery beneath a shrine. These are not images of power. They are images of grace and pleasure and the sweetness of life. And the beauty was everywhere, not only in the great frescoes. It flowed into everything the Minoans made: the shapes of their pottery, the settings of their jewels, the carving of their tiny seal stones, the very columns and staircases of their palaces. They seem to have had a genius for beauty woven into the whole fabric of their lives. A people who could not make even an ordinary cup or a storage jar without making it graceful. What kind of people paints its walls with dolphins and flowers and dancing girls, rather than with kings and conquests and gods of war? A people at peace, secure and prosperous, that loved the world and delighted in it. A people, one feels, that knew how to enjoy being alive. Across 3,500 years, their art reaches out and touches us with that delight and makes us love them. Of course, we must be a little careful. Much of what we see at Knossos today was heavily restored, a century ago, by the archaeologist who uncovered it, and some of the frescoes owe as much to his imagination as to the ancient painters. But enough survives, here and across the Minoan world, to leave no doubt of the truth. This was an art of extraordinary freshness, grace, and joy, unlike anything else in the ancient world. And at the very center of that bright and joyful art, again and again, stands one powerful image, an image sacred to the Minoans above all others, that fills their frescoes and their palaces and their myths, the bull. To the bull, and to the astonishing sacred game that the Minoans played with it, we now will turn. No animal was more sacred to the Minoans than the bull. Its image is everywhere in their world, painted on the walls, carved on the seals, modeled in clay and bronze and stone. Great horns of stone, which we call horns of consecration, crown the shrines and the rooftops of the palaces. The bull was, it seems, the very embodiment of power and fertility and the sacred, standing at the heart of Minoan religion and Minoan life. And with this sacred bull, the Minoans played the most extraordinary and dangerous game in all the ancient world. A game so astonishing that, for a long time, scholars could scarcely believe it was real. We call it bull leaping. And in the famous frescoes of Knossos, we can see it still. A great charging bull and young athletes, both men and women, vaulting clean over its back. Look closely at the most famous of these paintings. A powerful bull thunders forward, caught in mid-charge, its legs outstretched. At its head, a young leaper grasps the horns. Over its back, another somersaults in midair, upside down, hands and feet flying. And behind, a third has just landed, arms flung up in triumph. It is a scene of breathtaking daring and grace, young people dancing quite literally with death. How was it done? We are not entirely sure, and scholars still argue over it. Perhaps the leaper seized the charging bull by the horns and used the toss of its great head to fling themselves up and over. Perhaps there were more stages and helpers, and a whole choreography now lost. However it was managed, it demanded courage and athletic skill of an almost unimaginable order, for a single mistake before a charging bull could be the last a leaper ever made. Picture it, then, in the great central court of Knossos, beneath the watching windows and terraces of the palace. The crowd gathered, the drums perhaps sounding, the great bull loosed into the court, and the slender young leapers, trained from childhood, facing it with nothing but their own skill and daring. Seizing the horns, vaulting the back, landing and springing away, in a spectacle of beauty and terror at the very heart of the Minoan world. And it was surely far more than mere sport. To the Minoans, this dance with the sacred bull was almost certainly a religious rite, a ritual reenactment of some deep truth about power and life and death, about the mastery of the wild and holy force that the bull embodied. To leap the bull was to grapple and to dance with the sacred itself, and the young leapers were perhaps as much priests and priestesses as athletes. Here, surely, is another root of the great myth. For imagine the tales carried to the mainland, of the sea kings of Crete and their maze-like palace, and the sacred bull at its heart, and the young men and women, some of them perhaps sent as tribute from the mainland itself, who faced the bull in the great court, in a deadly game from which not all returned. Blend these together, and the Minotaur is born, the monstrous bull that devoured the young in the labyrinth. It is remarkable how much of the shimmering legend dissolves, on close looking, into solid Minoan fact. The labyrinthine palace, the sacred double axe that gave the maze its name, the bull at the heart of it all, the young people facing that bull in the central court, the sea kings who ruled the waves and may indeed have taken tribute from weaker lands across the water. The myth is not invention. It is memory transformed and heightened and made strange, but memory still. And the bull was not only leapt. Its image and its horns crowned the sacred places. Bulls were offered, it seems, in the great rites. Drinking vessels were carved in the shape of the bull's head, of stone and gold, with eyes of crystal and horns of gilded wood, beautiful and solemn objects, used, perhaps, to pour out offerings in the ceremonies of the sacred beast. There is a power in the image of the Minoan bull that reaches us even now, the great charging beast, and the fearless young leaper poised above its horns, frozen forever on the palace wall in a moment of grace and danger. It is, perhaps, the very emblem of the Minoans themselves, a people who danced, lightly and beautifully, with the wild and sacred forces of their world. The bull leads us, as it led the Minoans, from the games of the court into the deeper world of their religion, into the shrines and the sacred caves and the mountaintop sanctuaries where they worshipped their gods. And it is a world of great mystery, for the Minoans left us no scriptures we can read. We must piece their faith together from the beautiful and enigmatic things they left behind. To the gods of the Minoans we now will turn. What did the Minoans believe? Here, as so often with this silent people, we must move gently and humbly, piecing together their faith from images and objects in sacred places, without a single written prayer or myth in their own hand to guide us. But what we can see suggests a religion very different from those of the great kingdoms around them, a faith woven of nature and the sea and, above all, of a great and powerful goddess. For again and again in Minoan art, we meet the image of a woman who seems to be more than a woman, a goddess or her priestess, standing with arms raised or outstretched, attended by sacred animals and worshippers. The Minoan divine world seems to have been centered, above all, on the female and the goddess, a great mother, perhaps, of the earth and the wild things and the fruitful world, honored across the whole island. Among the most famous images they left us are the little faience figures we call the snake goddesses, small, exquisite statuettes of a woman in the flounced Minoan skirt and open bodice, her arms held out, and in each hand a writhing snake. Whether she is a goddess herself or her priestess, we cannot say for certain. But she stands, serene and commanding, a powerful emblem of the sacred feminine at the heart of Minoan faith. And their sacred places were not, for the most part, great temples like those of Egypt or the East. The Minoans worshipped, it seems, in humbler and wilder places, in caves deep in the mountains where they left offerings in the dark, on the bare peaks of the high hills, at open-air shrines we call peak sanctuaries, where they made their offerings to the sky, and in small shrines within the palaces and the homes, tended with flowers and precious things. Imagine a Minoan pilgrimage up to a peak sanctuary, the climb up the mountain in the clear island air, the little shrine on the summit, the offerings left there. Small clay figures of worshippers with hands pressed to their chests, of the animals they prized, of the parts of the body for which they sought healing. High between the earth and the sky, with the whole island and the sea spread out below, they made their prayers to the powers of heaven. And in the deep caves, they sought the powers of the earth and the underworld, descending with their lamps into the darkness, past the great dripping columns of stone to leave their offerings in the sacred deep. Some of these cave shrines were used for worship for thousands of years, long before the Minoans and long after. So holy did these dark and wondrous places feel to the people of the island. Everywhere in their sacred world stands the double axe, that emblem with its two blades, which we have already met as the possible root of the very word labyrinth. It appears carved on the pillars, painted on the walls, set up in the shrines, fashioned in bronze and gold. It was plainly among the most sacred of all Minoan symbols, though what exactly it meant to them, the power of the god, the sacrifice, the meeting of earth and sky, we can now only guess. And the natural world itself seems to have been, for the Minoans, shot through with the sacred. Sacred trees tended in their shrines, sacred birds alighting as signs of the goddess's presence, the sacred bull, the snakes, the lilies and the crocuses. Their religion, like their art, seems to have been rooted in a deep love and reverence for the living world of their beautiful island, the sea and the flowers and the creatures, all touched with the presence of the divine. We must be honest that much remains unknown, and even that the peaceful, nature-loving picture may not be the whole truth, for there are hints here and there of darker rites, of sacrifice offered in times of terror. But the overwhelming impression left by the Minoan sacred world is of a religion of nature and the goddess, of caves and mountaintops and flowering shrines, gentler and greener than the grim faiths of the great kingdoms around them. And it was a religion, above all, without great temples and god-kings, without the towering ziggurat or the pharaoh's pyramid, without the machinery of a state religion glorifying a divine ruler. The Minoans seem to have met their gods in the palace shrine, the mountain peak, the sacred cave, the flowering field, in the beautiful world itself, rather than in the shadow of a king. It is, like so much about them, a thing apart and lovely and their own. Whatever the truth of their faith, it flowered, like everything they touched, into beauty, into exquisite little figures and sacred vessels and jeweled offerings of the most extraordinary craft. For the Minoans were, along with everything else, among the finest craftsmen the ancient world ever produced, and to the treasures of their workshops, the pottery and the gold and the tiny carved seals, we now will turn. The Minoans loved beautiful things, and their craftsmen were among the greatest of the ancient world, turning out from the palace workshops a stream of exquisite objects, pottery and gold work, carved stone and ivory, tiny engraved seals, that still astonish us with their skill and their grace. In their hands, even the humblest materials became things of beauty. Their pottery, above all, is one of the glories of Minoan art. In the early days of the palaces they made a ware we call by the name of a sacred cave, Kamar's ware, of astonishing delicacy. Thin as an eggshell and painted in creamy white and glowing red on a dark ground, with swirling, curving, abstract designs full of movement and life, like the sea and the wind made visible upon the clay. And later they made what is perhaps the most beautiful pottery of the whole ancient world, the marine style. Upon their jars and cups they painted the living sea, octopuses with curling, reaching tentacles spreading right around the vessel, their great eyes staring, dolphins and fish, starfish and coral and seaweed, shells, and rocks. To hold a Minoan marine-style jar is to hold the whole living sea, caught and curled around the clay by an artist who loved it. They were masters of gold. From the palace workshops came jewelry of breathtaking delicacy. Golden pendants and diadems, rings engraved with sacred scenes, beads and chains and ornaments of the finest work. One famous pendant shows two bees or wasps, curved together about a drop of honey, wrought in gold with a precision that a modern jeweler would struggle to match, made 3,500 years ago. They carved stone into vessels of wonderful beauty, bowls and cups and ceremonial vases of colored and veined stone, shaped and hollowed and polished with only the simple tools of the Bronze Age. And they carved in relief ceremonial vases of dark stone with scenes of extraordinary life and skill, harvesters singing as they come home from the fields, athletes and boxers, a chieftain receiving a report, small masterpieces of narrative art. And they were, above all, the supreme masters of the tiny carved seal. For the Minoans, like other peoples of that world, used little engraved seal stones to mark their property and their documents, pressing them into soft clay. But they carved them with a skill and a beauty beyond any other. Tiny gems of stone, no bigger than a fingernail, engraved with astonishing detail. Animals and monsters, gods and worshippers, ships and bulls and scenes of the sacred, whole living images in miniature. To carve such a thing in hard stone at such a size, with the simple tools of the age, seems almost impossible, and yet they made them by the thousand, each a little jewel. Through these tiny carved seals, more than almost anything else, we glimpse the whole imaginative world of the Minoans. Their gods and their rituals, their ships and their animals, their myths and their daily life, all pressed into gems the size of a bean. They worked ivory, brought from the elephants of Africa and Asia, carving it into little figures of astonishing life, including, most famously, small ivory bull leapers, caught in the very act of the vault, their bodies stretched and straining, once fitted, perhaps, into a great scene of the sacred game. They inlaid and gilded and combined their materials, gold and ivory, crystal and faience, into objects of the richest beauty. And all of this, the eggshell pottery and the marine jars, the golden bees and the carved stone vases, the tiny seals and the ivory leapers, flowed out from the palace workshops in a great stream of beauty, to adorn the Minoan world and to be carried, prized, across the sea to the courts of Egypt and the East, where Minoan craft was treasured as among the finest that money could buy. For the Minoans' genius for beautiful things was not only their glory, it was their business. Their exquisite crafts were among the treasures they traded across the whole Eastern Sea, sought after by kings and nobles from Egypt to Asia. The beauty they made on their island traveled the length of the known world, and made them, along with all else, rich. And so we come to the wider world of the Minoans, to their trade and their reach, and to the great question of how far their power truly extended across the sea. But first we must confront the one great silence at the heart of it all. Their writing, which they used and left us in abundance, and which we still, to this very day, cannot read. To the mystery of the Minoan script we now will turn. For all their brilliance, the Minoans keep one great secret locked away from us, the deepest silence at the heart of their world. for they could write. They did write, and they left us their writing in abundance, pressed and scratched on clay tablets and carved on seals and painted on vessels. And yet, to this very day, we cannot read a word of it. The Minoans have a voice, and we cannot hear it. Their earliest writing was a kind of picture writing, a hieroglyphic script of little signs, a bee, a ship, an eye, a branch. And from it, in time, they developed a flowing script of lines and strokes that we call simply linear, a true writing system, used across the Minoan world for keeping the accounts of the palaces, for marking sacred offerings, for the business of a complex and literate civilization. We have a good deal of it. Clay tablets, especially, on which the palace scribes kept their records, baked hard and preserved, by chance, in the very fires that destroyed the palaces. We can see the signs clearly, we can count them, we can tell that it is real writing, obeying real rules, recording a real language. But that language, and the sounds and meanings of the signs, remain locked away from us. Now here is a strange and tantalizing twist. For after the Minoans, when the Greek-speaking Mycenaeans came to rule at Knossos, they adapted the Minoan script to write their own early form of Greek, a related script we call Linear B. And Linear B, in one of the triumphs of modern scholarship, has been deciphered. We can read it. We know it records an early Greek. So we can read the daughter script Linear B, and yet we still cannot read the mother script Linear A from which it came. For though many of the signs are shared, the underlying language is different. Linear B records Greek, but Linear A records the older, unknown tongue of the Minoans themselves, a language that seems to belong to no family we know, and for which we have no key, no bilingual text, no way in. And so we can sound out some of the Linear A signs using their values in the later Greek script, but when we do, we get only meaningless strings of syllables in an unknown language, words that mean nothing to us, the sounds of a tongue no living person has ever heard. We are like someone who can pronounce the letters of a book in a language they do not know, able to make the sounds, but not to grasp a single word of the meaning. Think of what is locked away behind that silence. The name this people called themselves and their island and their gods. The prayers they offered, the myths they told, the meaning of the double axe and the snake goddess and the sacred bull. The truth about their kings and their beliefs and their history. All of it, perhaps, is written there on the little clay tablets, and we cannot read a single word. It is the same ache we met far away among the lost cities of the Indus, the ache of having the writing but not the reading, of holding a message left by human hands and being locked forever out of its meaning by the simple loss of a key. The Minoans reach out to us in their own hand, and we cannot understand what they are trying to say. Perhaps one day the silence will break. Perhaps a longer text will be found or a bilingual inscription, some Minoan message written also in a tongue we know, and suddenly the tablets will speak, and the whole inner world of the Minoans will come flooding into words. Scholars still labor over it, and still hope, and every new tablet from the Cretan earth is studied with a quickening heart. Or perhaps their language is simply lost beyond recovery, and the Minoans are destined to remain, forever, the civilization we can see but cannot hear, known to us entirely through the beautiful things they made and the silent things they wrote, but never through their own words. Even so, their painted walls speak eloquently enough of who they were. For though we cannot read their tablets, we can read their frescoes, and these tell us, without a single word, of a people who loved beauty and the sea and the living world. And they tell us, too, of the ordinary daily life of the island, the towns, the homes, the work, the pleasures of the Minoan people. Let us turn now from the silent script to the warm and human life of the Minoan world. Beyond the great palaces, the Minoan world was a land of busy towns and quiet villages, of harbors and farms and workshops, where the ordinary people of the island lived their lives. And thanks to the things they left behind, their houses, their tools, their paintings, we can glimpse that life with real warmth, a comfortable, prosperous, sea-loving existence lived in one of the most beautiful lands on earth. The towns clustered about the palaces and along the coasts, a tangle of neat houses of stone and mud brick and timber, several stories high, packed along narrow winding streets and little squares. And the houses were fine and comfortable, many-roomed, with staircases and light wells, with drains and good plaster floors, some of them small mansions with their own frescoes and fine furnishings. The Minoans, high and low, seemed to have lived well. Their life was built, like all Mediterranean life, upon the great trinity of grain, olive and vine, bread, oil and wine, supplemented by the sheep and goats on the hills, the fruit of the orchards, the honey of the bees, and above all the endless bounty of the sea, thick with fish and shellfish and squid, which the island people harvested and loved. A Minoan table was a rich and varied one, the good food of a generous land. And they knew how to enjoy it. Their art shows us feasts and gatherings, dancing and music, the lyre and the flute, the sistrum and the drum. It shows us games and processions and celebrations. The Minoans, secure and prosperous behind their sea, seem to have been a people who knew how to take pleasure in life, in food and wine, in music and dance, in beauty and company and the sweetness of their island world. And their frescoes reveal something else remarkable that sets them apart from most of the ancient world, the prominence and the evident freedom and dignity of their women. Everywhere in Minoan art, women appear elegant, confident, richly dressed, at the very center of the great ceremonies and gatherings, seated in places of honor, taking part in the public life of the community as full and prominent figures. The great goddess at the center of their religion, the priestesses in their rites, the elegant ladies of the frescoes, watching the games and the processions from the best seats, the very prominence of the female form in all their art, all of it suggests a society in which women held a place of unusual honor and importance, far greater than in most of the ancient kingdoms around them. It is one more way in which the Minoan world seems gentler and more balanced and more humane. We see the Minoans in their own paintings as a slender, graceful, elegant people proud of their appearance. The men with long dark hair and narrow waists, the women with elaborate curled and braided hairstyles, both dressed in fine and colorful clothes. They loved ornament, jewelry of gold and precious stones, sealstones worn as rings, fine woven and dyed cloth. They took evident delight in beauty, in themselves as in all things. And around this comfortable life turned the great engine of the palace economy. The farmers brought their produce to the palace stores. The scribes recorded it on their clay tablets. The craftsmen in the palace workshops turned raw materials into treasures. The ships carried the goods abroad and brought foreign riches home. It was a complex, organized, prosperous economy, gathering the wealth of the whole island and turning it into the beauty and comfort of the Minoan world. It was not, we should remember, a world of equals. There were the powerful and the humble, the rich in their mansions and the laborers in the fields, and no doubt hardship and inequality enough. But even so, the overall impression from all they left behind is of a broadly prosperous and comfortable society, at peace with itself and its neighbors, that had learned, better than almost any people of its age, the difficult art of living well. Picture, then, an evening in a Minoan town. The day's work done, the fishing boats drawn up on the shore, the smell of cooking and olive wood smoke drifting through the narrow streets, the sound of a flute from an open doorway, the last light going golden on the painted walls and the blue sea beyond, the people at their doors in the warm island dusk. It is a scene of deep and settled peace 3,500 years ago. And at the heart of that world stood the great palace, its life turning through the day like the beating of a heart. Let us go there now, into Knossos itself, and follow a single day within its winding halls, from the waking of the palace at dawn to its settling into quiet at nightfall, and feel, for a little while, the living pulse of the Minoan world at its very center. Dawn comes softly over Crete, the light spreading pink and gold across the sea and touching the hills where the great palace stands. And Knossos begins to stir. The first sunlight slants through the light wells and the columned porches. The smoke of the first fires rises, and the vast winding palace, with its hundreds of rooms and its many hundreds of people, wakes to another day at the center of the Minoan world. In the great storerooms, the day's work begins among the rows of towering jars, the oil and wine and grain measured out, the stores checked, the scribes at their clay tablets recording every measure that comes in and goes out, in the flowing signs of the script we cannot read. The wealth of the whole region flows through these dim and fragrant magazines, the beating economic heart of the palace. In the workshops, the craftsmen bend to their labor, the potter at his wheel shaping the fine clay, the goldsmith over his tiny, exquisite work, the seal cutter engraving his gem no bigger than a bean, the weaver at the loom, the mason and the fresco painter at their walls. From these rooms flows the endless stream of beautiful things that adorns the Minoan world and fills its trading ships. Through the winding corridors and up and down the many staircases move the people of the palace, servants and officials, priestesses and craftsmen, bearers carrying goods, children running. Sunlight and shadow fall across the red columns and the painted walls. The sound of voices and work echoes through the halls. The whole great complex hums with the ordered, busy life of a small city under one roof. In the fine apartments, the great ones of Knossos go about their day among the frescoes and the light wells, in rooms with painted dolphins on the walls, with fine bathrooms and clever drains, with terraces looking out over the town and the distant sea. Whoever they were, kings, priest-rulers, noble families, they lived surrounded by a comfort and a beauty that few in that ancient world could match. And in the shrines, the sacred life of the palace goes on. the tending of the holy places, the offerings before the goddess and the double axe, the flowers and the precious things laid out, the quiet rituals that bound the palace to the powers of heaven and earth. For Knossos was a great temple as well as a great house and a great storehouse, its sacred and its worldly life woven inseparably together. Perhaps on this day, there are games in the great central court, the crowd gathering along the terraces and at the windows, the drums sounding, the sacred bull loosed, the young leapers facing it in their deadly and beautiful dance. Or perhaps a great procession winds through the halls, bearing offerings to the shrine, the participants in their finery, as we see them still upon the painted walls. Down at the harbor, meanwhile, the ships come and go, the graceful Minoan vessels putting out to sea or returning laden, the goods of the palace carried down to be loaded, the treasures of foreign lands brought up to the stores. The life of Knossos reaches out, through its harbor, across the whole sea, and the whole sea flows back, through the harbor, into Knossos. And as the long bright day draws toward its close, the pace of the palace eases. The workshops fall quiet, the storerooms are sealed, the last business is done. The light turns golden and then rose across the western sea. The lamps are lit in the halls and the apartments, and the great winding palace, its day's work done, settles slowly toward the quiet of the island night. It is a scene of extraordinary sophistication and peace, 3,500 years ago. A great, beautiful, well-run palace, at the heart of a prosperous and art-loving civilization, secure behind its ships, settling gently into the evening above the darkening sea. But the greatness of Knossos, and of all the Minoan world, rested on its reach across that sea, on the far-flung trade and influence that made the island rich. To that wider world we now will turn. The Minoans were the great traders and seafarers of their age, and their reach extended across the whole of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. From their island at the crossroads of the sea, their ships fanned out in every direction, weaving Crete into a great web of Bronze Age trade that bound together the civilizations of 3 continents. They needed to trade, above all, for metal. For their whole world was built on bronze, and bronze required copper and tin, and neither was found in plenty on Crete. The copper came, much of it, from the great mines of the island of Cyprus, away to the east. The tin from sources far more distant still, carried vast distances across land and sea. To gather these precious metals, the Minoans reached out across the whole known world. And in exchange they sent out the treasures of Crete, the beautiful pottery, the fine woven cloth, the worked bronze, the exquisite crafts, the olive oil and the wine. Minoan goods have been found scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, on the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, on Cyprus and the coasts of Asia, and far to the south in the land of Egypt itself. For the connection with mighty Egypt was among the most important of all. Across the open sea, Minoan traders carried the goods of Crete to the wealthiest kingdom of the age, and the Egyptians knew them and prized their wares. In Egyptian tomb paintings we can see them, envoys from a land the Egyptians called Keftiu, almost certainly Crete, bearing gifts and goods, dressed in the distinctive Minoan kilt, their long hair falling in the Minoan style. And most wonderfully of all, the influence flowed both ways. For in Egypt, and in the lands of the East, palaces have been found whose walls were painted with frescoes in the pure Minoan style. Leaping bulls, running spirals, the very techniques and images of Crete, painted, it seems, by Minoan artists themselves, carried far from home to adorn the palaces of foreign kings. The fame of Minoan art had spread across the whole civilized world. Closer to home, the Minoan reach was greater still. Across the scattered islands of the Aegean, and even on the coasts of the Greek mainland, Minoan influence lay heavy, in the pottery, the art, the writing, the whole way of life. Some of these places may have been Minoan colonies or trading posts. Some, perhaps, were bound to Crete as subjects or allies. All felt the powerful pull of the great island civilization at the center of their sea. It is this wide dominion that may lie behind the legend of King Minos and his sea empire, the memory of a time when Crete truly did rule the waves, when its ships were supreme, when the islands and coasts of the Aegean looked to the great island as the center of their world, and when, perhaps, weaker peoples of the mainland sent tribute across the water to the lords of the Labyrinth. Picture the whole bright web of it, the Minoan ships crossing the blue sea in every direction, laden with the treasures of Crete, the foreign goods flowing back to the palace stores, the Minoan artists painting bulls on the walls of Egyptian and Eastern palaces, the islands of the Aegean living in the Minoan manner, the whole Eastern Sea humming with a trade and a culture that radiated out from the one green island at its heart. And so the Minoans stood, in their great age, at the very summit of their world, the first great civilization of Europe, masters of the sea, rich with the trade of 3 continents, secure behind their ships, dwelling in their painted palaces, making the most beautiful art of the age, and dominating the whole of their bright blue world. It must have seemed to them that it would last forever. But it would not. For out in that same blue sea, not far to the north of Crete, there lay another island, smaller and beautiful and Minoan too, at the heart of which stood a mountain. And that mountain was a sleeping volcano, gathering its terrible strength in silence beneath the happy island world. To that island, and to the town that flourished in the volcano's shadow, we now must go. About 70 miles north of Crete, out in the blue Aegean, there lay in those days a beautiful and prosperous island, round and green, and ringed with cliffs, with a fine harbor and rich fields. We call it today Thera or Santorini. And it was, in the great age of the Minoans, a thriving part of their bright world, dotted with towns, alive with trade, painted with the same joyful art as Crete itself. But the island held a secret in its heart. For its rounded shape and its ring of cliffs and its deep central bay were not the work of ordinary geology. Thera was a volcano, a great sleeping volcano, its cone rising from the sea, its fires banked and quiet beneath the green and pleasant surface. And the people who lived upon it, in their thriving towns, went about their happy lives with no notion of the terrible power sleeping beneath their feet. The greatest of their towns we call Akrotiri on the southern shore of the island, and it is one of the most extraordinary places in all the ancient world. For Akrotiri was a rich and sophisticated Minoan town, a bustling port of several stories high houses and workshops and fine squares, and it was buried, whole and entire, beneath the ash of the great eruption, and preserved, like a Bronze Age town caught in a photograph, for 3,500 years. It is often called the Pompeii of the Aegean, and like Pompeii, it gives us an astonishing window into the daily life of its age. But Akrotiri is older than Pompeii by 15 centuries and more, and it lets us see not a Roman town, but a living Minoan one, its streets and houses and workshops preserved just as they were in the last days before the mountain woke. Walk its excavated streets, and the wonder of it takes hold. Here are the houses, still standing 2 and 3 stories high, their walls and windows and staircases intact. Here are the narrow paved streets and the little squares. Here are the great storage jars still in place, the pots and tools and furniture, the drains beneath the streets, the whole fabric of a living town, frozen in the moment before its end. And here, above all, are the frescoes, for the houses of Akrotiri were painted, like all the Minoan world, with the most beautiful wall paintings, and buried and preserved by the ash in a freshness that even Crete cannot match. From the walls of these buried rooms have come some of the greatest treasures of Minoan art, glowing as bright as the day they were painted 3,500 years ago. There is a whole wall showing a fleet of ships sailing in procession between 2 towns, past dolphins and leaping fish, a great panorama of the Minoan sea world, with its harbors and its houses and its people, painted in loving detail. There are boys boxing and antelopes gracefully drawn. There are swallows darting among red lilies on a spring hillside. There is a young fisherman proudly holding up his catch. It is the Minoan love of life, caught forever on the walls of a doomed town. Picture Akrotiri, then in its last days of ordinary life. A prosperous, sophisticated, beautiful town, its people going about their business in the narrow streets, the ships in the harbor, the frescoes glowing on the walls, the sun warm on the green island, the great sea sparkling all around, and beneath it all, unfelt and unknown, the terrible pressure building in the depths of the mountain. And here is the most remarkable and the most merciful fact of all about Akrotiri. When it was excavated, no bodies were found. Unlike Pompeii, where the people were caught and buried where they fell, the town of Akrotiri was found empty. Its people, it seems, had gone. For the mountain, it appears, gave a warning. Before the great eruption, there were earthquakes, tremors that shook the town, cracked its walls, and clearly frightened its people. And the people of Akrotiri, wise and afraid, seemed to have gathered up what they could and fled, taking to their ships, abandoning their beautiful town, escaping across the sea before the mountain loosed its full and terrible fury. We find the town they left, but not, thank goodness, the people. Where they went and whether they reached safety we cannot know. But the empty streets of Akrotiri, with their frozen life and their glowing frescoes and their absent people, tell a story of a community that saw its doom approaching and fled before it. And into the beautiful, abandoned town, and across the whole bright Minoan world, the mountain was about to unleash one of the most violent events in the history of the human race. Let us linger a little longer in the buried town before the fire comes, for Akrotiri is so precious a window into the Minoan world that we should look through it well. It shows us, in a way that even Knossos cannot, the ordinary texture of Minoan life, Not the great palace, but the real houses of a real town, and the real people who lived in them, caught in the last moment of their ordinary days. The houses were fine and comfortable, some of them small mansions of several stories, with many rooms, with staircases and windows, with lavatories connected to drains beneath the streets, with walls plastered smooth and painted with frescoes. Ordinary townsfolk, it seems not just kings and priests, lived in real comfort and beauty. It is a vision of a prosperous middle world, 3,500 years ago, that few other ancient sites can give us. And the frescoes of these ordinary houses are among the loveliest things the Minoans ever made. In one room, a whole wall of swallows' darts and wheels above a hillside of red volcanic rock starred with red lilies. Spring itself caught on a wall. In another, 2 boys, their heads shaved but for long locks, spar in a friendly boxing match. In another, elegant women gather flowers or move in what seems a sacred procession. And that great fresco of the ships, the miniature frieze that ran around a whole room, is a treasure beyond price. A panorama of the Minoan sea world, showing a fleet of decorated ships sailing between 2 harbor towns, with people watching from the shore and the rooftops, dolphins in the water, the whole life of the coast laid out in loving miniature detail. Through it, we look straight into the maritime heart of the Minoan world. From these paintings and from the objects left in the houses, the pots and tools and furniture, the loom weights and the storage jars, the little things of daily life, the archaeologists have pieced together the living world of Akrotiri with extraordinary richness. We know how they built, how they cooked, how they wove, how they traded, how they decorated their homes. A whole ordinary Bronze Age life stands revealed. And all of it was preserved by the very thing that destroyed it. For the ash that buried Akrotiri also sealed it and protected it from the ravages of the following ages, holding the walls up, keeping the frescoes fresh, guarding the town hall beneath its blanket of volcanic stone, until the archaeologists came in our own time to dig it out again and give it back to the light. There is a strange and poignant beauty in that the greatest catastrophe of the Minoan world should also have created its most perfect memorial, that the fire which destroyed the bright town should also have preserved it, frozen and glowing, for us to find, that Akrotiri should speak to us so vividly of Minoan life precisely because of the death that fell upon it. And it lets us feel more sharply than anywhere else the human reality of what was coming. For here are real houses, where real families lived, cooked their meals, wove their cloth, raised their children, painted their walls with the swallows and the lilies they loved. Here is a real, warm, ordinary human world, prosperous and at peace, poised, all unknowing, on the very brink of annihilation. We can only be grateful that they seem to have escaped, that the streets, when opened, held no huddled dead, that the warnings came and were heeded and the people fled. But they fled from everything they had, their homes, their town, their whole known world, out onto the uncertain sea, as the mountain that had sheltered them prepared to tear their island apart. And now, at last, the fire comes. For beneath the beautiful island, the pressure had been building through the long ages, until it could be held no longer, and Thera awoke, and loosed upon the world one of the most colossal volcanic eruptions in all of human history. Let us witness it gently, from a safe distance across the centuries, the day the mountain of the Aegean blew itself apart. No one who saw the eruption of Thera in its full fury lived to describe it, and so we must reconstruct it from the evidence in the earth and the sea, the layers of ash, the shattered island, the marks the catastrophe left across the whole region. But that evidence tells us, beyond doubt, that it was one of the very greatest volcanic eruptions of the last 10,000 years, a cataclysm almost beyond the power of the mind to grasp. It did not come, in the end, without warning. First, as we have seen, came the earthquakes, shaking the towns and frightening the people into flight. Then, perhaps, came the first eruptions, columns of ash and pumice rising from the mountain, blanketing the island, a terrifying prelude. And then, at last, the mountain reached its final, world-shaking climax. Picture it, from far off across the safe distance of the sea. A column of ash and fire blasting upward from the heart of the island, rising miles and miles into the sky, until it spread out at the top into a vast, spreading canopy of darkness, blotting out the sun. Lightning crawled through the boiling cloud. The roar of it must have been heard for hundreds of miles, and the whole sky, for a vast distance around, turned black with the mountain's fury. The volcano hurled out an almost unimaginable quantity of rock and ash, enough to bury Akrotiri deep, to blanket the surrounding islands, to fall upon the sea and the lands for hundreds of miles around. Great glowing avalanches of ash and gas swept down the mountain and out across the ground. The very air, for a great distance, became a killing storm of ash and stone and fire. And then came the final convulsion. Having emptied its vast chamber of molten rock in the eruption, the mountain could no longer support its own weight, and the whole center of the island collapsed, in a titanic ruin, down into the emptied depths, and the sea rushed roaring in to fill the void. Where the green cone of the volcano had stood, there was now a vast flooded crater, a great ring of shattered cliffs around a drowned and steaming bay. The island of Thera, in the space of that catastrophe, was quite literally torn apart, its heart blown out and collapsed into the sea, its beautiful towns buried under yards of ash, its whole rounded shape reduced to the broken ring of cliffs and drowned caldera that we see, in awe to this day. It is one of the most dramatic scars the earth has ever inflicted upon a human world. And the effects reached out across the whole region. The ash fell in a great plume, carried on the winds, over the islands and the sea and the distant coasts, falling upon Crete itself 70 miles away, darkening its skies, dusting its fields. The bang of the final explosion may have been among the loudest sounds ever heard by human ears. And the sea, convulsed by the collapse of the island, rose up in a wall of water and rushed outward across the Aegean. For the collapse of the island into the sea sent out a tsunami, a great wave or series of waves, racing across the water in every direction at the speed of a storm. And these waves, gathering height as they rushed toward the shallows, fell at last upon the coasts of the surrounding lands, and above all upon the northern coast of Crete, the very heartland of the Minoan world, where the great harbors and coastal towns lay open and unsuspecting before the sea. We cannot say with certainty exactly how great the wave was when it reached Crete, or how much destruction it wrought. But a tsunami born of so vast a collapse, striking the harbors and the low coastal towns and the beached fleets of the Minoans, must have been a catastrophe of the first order, smashing the ships that were the very foundation of Minoan power, drowning the coastal settlements, and dealing a terrible blow to the sea empire at its most vulnerable point, the shore. Imagine it from the Minoan side. The strange darkening of the northern sky, the fall of gray ash upon the fields, the distant unimaginable roar, and then, without warning, the sea drawing back and rising and rushing in, the great wave falling upon the harbors and the fleets and the coastal towns of the happy island world. In a single day, the earth and the sea had risen against the Minoans as they never had before. What exactly did the eruption of Thera do to the Minoan world? This is one of the great questions of ancient history, and one that scholars still debate with vigor. For a long time, it was thought that the eruption struck at the very height of Minoan power and destroyed it at a stroke, a single, sudden, spectacular doom. The truth, as so often, seems to be more complicated and more interesting. The careful study of the layers in the earth suggests that the great eruption may have come somewhat before the final fall of the Minoans. That Crete, though grievously struck, did not perish at once, but survived the catastrophe and lingered on, weakened, for a generation or more before its final end. The eruption, it seems, was not the single death blow of legend, but the first and greatest of a series of blows that, together, brought the Minoan world down. But grievous it surely was. Consider the harm. The tsunami, striking the northern coast, must have shattered the fleets and drowned the harbor towns. And the fleet was the very heart of Minoan power, the wooden wall behind which the unwalled island lived in safety. To lose the ships was to lose the mastery of the sea, and to lose the mastery of the sea was to lose everything that made the Minoans great. And the ash brought its own slow ruin. Falling upon the fields of Crete, it may have poisoned the soil and ruined the harvests, not for 1 year but for several, bringing hunger and hardship to a land that had known long plenty. The darkening of the sky, the failure of the crops, the loss of the trade that the shattered fleet could no longer carry, all of these would have struck at the prosperity on which the whole Minoan order rested. And there was, perhaps, a deeper wound still, a wound to the spirit. For the Minoans had lived, for centuries, in a security and a confidence almost unique in the ancient world, secure behind their sea, at peace, prosperous, blessed. And now the very earth and sea that had sheltered them had turned against them with a violence beyond anything in their experience. A catastrophe that must have shaken their deepest faith in the order and safety of their world. Imagine the aftermath across Crete. The wrecked harbors and the lost ships, the ash-poisoned fields and the failing harvests, the drowned and ruined coastal towns, the frightened and grieving people, the whole confident, prosperous, peaceful order of the Minoan world suddenly cracked and shaken to its foundations. They had done nothing wrong. They had simply lived in the shadow of a mountain whose fury no one could have foreseen. And a civilization so wounded, its fleet broken, its trade disrupted, its harvests failing, its confidence shattered, was a civilization suddenly vulnerable, in a way it had never been before, to the dangers of its world. The sea that had been its moat could no longer be so surely held. The enemies and rivals it had never needed to fear now found the great island weakened and open as it had never been to their ambition. For out on the Greek mainland in these very generations, a new power was rising, a harder, more warlike people, the Mycenaean Greeks, who built their citadels behind mighty walls and buried their kings with weapons of war. Long overshadowed by the brilliance of Crete, they had learned much from the Minoans, and now, as the great island reeled from the fury of the mountain, their moment was coming at last. And so the eruption of Thera, though it did not destroy the Minoans at a single stroke, may well have been the beginning of their end. The great wound that broke their power on the sea, shook their prosperity and their confidence, and opened the door at last to the rivals who would inherit their world. To the long twilight of the Minoans and the coming of the Greeks, we now gently must turn. After the great eruption, the Minoan world did not simply vanish. It lingered on for a time, wounded and weakened but still alive. The palaces still stood, the people still farmed and fished and traded, the frescoes still glowed on the walls. But something had changed deep down. The long age of confidence and security was over, and a shadow had fallen across the bright island world that would never quite lift again. For the blows of the catastrophe, though not immediately fatal, went deep. The fleet, shattered by the wave, could not easily be rebuilt, and without its unquestioned mastery of the sea, Crete lost the very foundation of its power and safety. The trade faltered. The harvests, poisoned by ash, may have failed. The wealth that had flowed so freely into the palaces slowed to a trickle. The great engine of the Minoan world was damaged and running down. And there is evidence in these years of a world grown suddenly harder and more fearful. Where the Minoans had once lived open and unwalled, secure in their peace, now we find signs of trouble and defense. A people, it seems, no longer quite so safe, no longer quite so confident, beginning to know the fear that the rest of that violent age had always lived with. For the loss of the fleet meant that the sea, which had been the Minoans' great protecting moat, was a moat no longer. The unwalled towns of Crete, which had lain safe for centuries behind the shield of their navy, now lay open and vulnerable, in a way they never had before, to any enemy who could cross the water. The whole basis of Minoan security had been swept away by the wave. Picture Crete in these twilight years, the palaces still standing, but the bustle diminished, the harbors quieter, the ships fewer, the confidence gone out of the bright world, the people going about their lives beneath a new and unaccustomed sense of unease. It was not yet the end. But the greatness was fading, the light was dimming, and the island was no longer master of its own fate. And into this weakened world, the rivals came. For across the sea on the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean Greeks had been growing in power and ambition, a people very different from the Minoans, whom in some ways they resembled and from whom they had learned so much, but whose spirit was harder, more warlike, more hungry for conquest and gold. Where the Minoans had built open, unwalled, art-loving palaces, the Mycenaeans built grim citadels behind titanic walls of stone, and buried their warrior kings with masks of gold and hordes of bronze weapons. They were a people of war, of raiding and conquest, of the sword and the fortress, and they had long looked with envious eyes upon the wealth and the brilliance of the great island to their south. For centuries, the sheer power and sophistication of the Minoans had held the mainlanders in check and drawn them, instead, into the orbit of Cretan culture. The Mycenaeans had eagerly copied Minoan art, adopted Minoan ways, imported Minoan treasures, in admiring imitation of their brilliant neighbor. But now the balance had shifted. The teacher was weakened, the pupil was strong, and the pupil's ambition was ready. And so, in these generations after the eruption, the Mycenaean Greeks reached out across the sea toward the wounded island, whether by trade, by settlement, by pressure, or at last by conquest, we cannot always tell. But the signs are clear that the mainlanders came to Crete in growing numbers and growing power, and that the great island, once the ruler of the sea, began to fall at last, under the sway of the very people it had once so far surpassed. The clearest sign of all is written in the clay. For at Knossos, in its final period, the palace records are no longer kept in the old Minoan script, the undeciphered Linear A. They are kept in Linear B, the adapted script that records not the old Minoan tongue, but Greek. The masters of Knossos in its last age were writing in Greek. The Greeks had come to the Labyrinth, and the palace of Minos now answered to mainland lords. So the great reversal was complete, or nearly so. The first civilization of Europe, the sea kings who had ruled the waves and taught the mainland its arts, now overshadowed and overtaken by their rougher pupils, the island's ancient glory passing into Greek hands. And it remained only for the final blow to fall, for the great palaces, the beating hearts of the Minoan world, to meet their end at last. The Mycenaean Greeks who now came to dominate Crete were, as we have seen, a people of a very different temper from the Minoans, and to understand the end of the Minoan world, we must understand the newcomers who inherited it. For with them, a harder age was dawning across the whole Aegean, and the gentle, art-loving spirit of the Minoans was passing away. The Mycenaeans took their name from Mycenae, the greatest of their mainland citadels, a fortress crowning a rocky hill, ringed with walls of stone blocks so vast that later Greeks believed they had been built by giants. Behind such walls the Mycenaean lords dwelt, and from them they sallied out to raid and trade and war. They were the Greeks of the heroic age, the world in time of the great legends of gods and heroes. And they were warriors to the bone. Their graves were filled with weapons, swords and daggers and spearheads of bronze. Their art delighted in the hunt and the battle and the siege. Their kings were laid to rest at Mycenae behind masks of beaten gold, with treasures of war heaped about them. Where the Minoans had painted dolphins and lilies, the Mycenaeans painted warriors and chariots and the grim business of the sword. Yet they had learned almost everything from the Minoans. They had taken Minoan art and Minoan craft and made them their own. They had adapted the Minoan script to write their Greek. They had absorbed Minoan religion and Minoan luxury and Minoan skill. Mycenaean civilization was, in large part, the brilliant Minoan achievement taken up by a harder people and bent to harder ends. The pupil had learned his lesson well, and now turned it upon his teacher. When exactly the Mycenaeans took control of Knossos, and how, whether by gradual infiltration, by alliance and intermarriage, or by outright conquest, we cannot say for certain. But by the final period of the Great Palace, the evidence is plain. Greek-speaking Mycenaean lords ruled at Knossos, kept its records in Greek, and governed the island that had once been the heart of the Minoan world. For a time, under these new masters, Knossos still flourished, perhaps more powerfully than ever, now the center of a Mycenaean dominion over Crete, its storerooms full, its scribes busy with their Greek accounts of sheep and grain and chariots and swords. The old palace lived on and even prospered under the new lords. But it was no longer truly Minoan. The spirit had changed. The sea kings were gone. The labyrinth answered now to the men of the mainland. And the wider Minoan world was fading fast. The other great palaces, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, had mostly met their ends, destroyed or abandoned in the troubled years, and were not rebuilt to their old glory. The far-flung Minoan trade, the Minoan influence across the islands, the whole bright web that had radiated out from Crete, all shrank and dimmed as the sea empire passed away. Only Knossos, under its Greek masters, still burned on, the last great light of a dying world. It is a poignant thing to contemplate, the gentle, brilliant, peace-loving civilization of the Minoans that had ruled the sea by beauty and trade rather than by the sword, passing in its weakness under the dominion of the warlike people it had once so far outshone. The age of the dolphins and the lilies giving way to the age of the warriors and the walls, the first bright civilization of Europe fading into the harder world of the Greek heroes. And yet, in that very passing, something of the Minoans was saved. For the Mycenaeans carried the Minoan inheritance forward, the art, the craft, the writing, the skills, the memories, into the mainstream of Greek civilization, and so, in time, into the whole civilization of the West. The Minoans did not simply vanish. They were, in a sense, absorbed, their genius poured into the great river of Greek culture that would flow on down the ages. But the palaces themselves were doomed. For the whole Mycenaean world, and the last Minoan glory with it, was rushing toward a great and general catastrophe, a wave of destruction that would sweep across the entire eastern Mediterranean and bring the whole brilliant Bronze Age crashing down. And in that great fall, the last of the Minoan palaces would meet its end at last. The end, when it came in fire. For the great palace of Knossos, the last living heart of the Minoan world, was at length destroyed, burned, its walls blackened, its rooms buried in the ash and rubble of its own ruin, never to rise again. And with its burning, the long story of the Minoan palaces, which had endured for the better part of 1,000 years, came finally to its close. Exactly how and exactly when, and at whose hand Knossos met its end, we cannot say with certainty, whether by war, by rebellion, by earthquake and accident, or by the general catastrophe that was engulfing the whole Bronze Age world. But burn it did, and the fire that destroyed it also, by baking hard its clay tablets, preserved the last records of the palace, the Greek accounts of its final days, frozen in the flames for us to read 3,000 years later. And Knossos did not fall alone. For across the whole eastern Mediterranean, in these same dark generations, a great wave of collapse was rolling. A mysterious and terrible unraveling in which, within the span of a few decades, almost every great civilization of the Bronze Age was shaken, and many were swept away. The Mycenaean citadels burned, great kingdoms fell, cities were abandoned, and a long darkness descended over the whole region. The causes of that great collapse are debated to this day, a tangle, it seems, of many troubles falling together: drought and famine, earthquake and war, the movement of peoples, the breakdown of the delicate web of trade on which the whole Bronze Age world depended. Whatever the truth, the result was a catastrophe of civilizations, and in it, the last embers of the Minoan world were finally extinguished. So the palaces fell silent, and the fires went out, and the great world of Bronze Age Crete passed away. The frescoes crumbled, the storerooms lay buried, the harbors emptied, the seacraft was forgotten. The bright, sea-loving, art-making civilization of the Minoans, which had flourished for centuries and ruled the waves and made the most joyful art of the ancient world, dwindled at last into ruin and silence and the long forgetting of the ages. And the forgetting was almost complete. For after the fall, a long dark age settled over Greece and the Aegean. The very art of writing was lost, the great palaces crumbled, the memory of the Bronze Age glory faded into legend. The Greeks, who slowly rose again in later centuries into the classical world we know, had almost no true knowledge of the Minoans at all. The first civilization of Europe had passed out of memory and into the mists of myth. Almost, but not quite. For the Greeks kept, in their oldest legends, a strange and shimmering memory of that lost world. A memory of a great sea king named Minos, who ruled from Crete and mastered the waves. Of his vast and winding palace, the Labyrinth. Of the monstrous bull-man at its heart. Of the tribute of young Athenians sent to feed it, and of the hero who came at last to slay the monster and end the terror. In these shining myths, the ghost of the Minoan world lived on. And there may have been another, even greater memory. For the philosopher Plato, long after, told a haunting tale of a great and happy island civilization, rich and powerful and blessed, that had flourished long ago beyond the memory of the Greeks, and that had been destroyed, in a single terrible day and night, by earthquake and flood, and swallowed forever beneath the sea. He called it Atlantis. And many have wondered, ever since, whether behind that famous legend lies a distant memory of the Minoans, and of the island torn apart by the fury of the sea. We cannot know for certain. The tale of Atlantis is Plato's own, wrapped in his own meanings, and no one can prove its roots. But the echoes are haunting. A great and gifted island sea power, at the height of its glory, destroyed in a day by a catastrophe of earthquake and wave, and lost beneath the sea, remembered only in legend. Whether or not Plato knew it, the fate of the Minoans reads like the very pattern of the Atlantis myth. And so the Minoans passed into legend at both ends, remembered as the Labyrinth and the Minotaur, and perhaps as drowned Atlantis itself, while the truth of them, the real bright civilization behind the myths, lay lost and buried and forgotten beneath the Cretan earth. For more than 3,000 years it slept there, unknown and unsuspected, waiting for someone, at last, to dig it up again, and to prove that the labyrinth was real. Let us pause before the rediscovery to dwell a little on the myths themselves, for they are among the most beautiful the world has ever told, and in them we now know the Minoan world lived on in disguise for 3,000 years. The Greeks did not know they were remembering a real civilization, but remember it they did, transformed into some of their most haunting and enduring stories. There was King Minos, the great and terrible ruler of Crete, master of the sea, so mighty that even distant Athens was forced to send him tribute, and behind him, surely, the memory of the real sea kings of Knossos, who ruled the waves and drew tribute from the weaker peoples of the Aegean. The Greeks even remembered Minos as a lawgiver and a judge, so wise that after his death he became a judge of the dead in the underworld. There was the Labyrinth, the maze of 1,000 winding ways, built by the master craftsman Daedalus so cunningly that its own maker could scarcely find the way out, and behind it, the real winding palace of Knossos, with its hundreds of rooms and its bewildering complexity, the house of the double axe remembered as the house of the endless maze. There was the Minotaur, the dreadful being with a man's body and a bull's head, penned in the heart of the labyrinth, to whom the young of Athens were sent as food, and behind it, the sacred bull of the Minoans, its horns and its image everywhere in the palace, and the young leapers, some perhaps sent as tribute, who faced it in the great court in the deadly and beautiful game. And there was the hero, Theseus, Prince of Athens, who came among the tribute youths resolved to slay the monster, and the Princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos, who loved him and gave him a simple ball of thread to unwind as he went, so that, having killed the Minotaur in the depths of the maze, he could follow the thread back out again to the light and freedom and escape. The thread of Ariadne, the little clue that leads out of the labyrinth, has become a byword in every language of the West. And there was Daedalus himself, the master craftsman who built the labyrinth, imprisoned by Minos and longing to escape the island, who made, for himself and his son Icarus, wings of feathers and wax, and flew up and away across the sea. And how young Icarus, in the joy of flight, soared too high, too near the sun, until the wax of his wings melted, and he fell, and was lost in the sea that bears his name. A story of genius and of soaring too high that has never stopped being told. These are among the greatest of all the Greek myths: Minos and the labyrinth, the Minotaur and the thread, Daedalus and the fall of Icarus. And they are, we now understand, the Minoan world remembered, broken, transformed, made strange and marvelous, but the Minoan world all the same, living on in the imagination of humankind for 3,000 years after the palaces fell. There is something profoundly moving in that a whole civilization, utterly forgotten, its very existence unknown, should nonetheless have survived, hidden, at the heart of the world's most beloved stories. That every child who has ever thrilled to the tale of the labyrinth and the Minotaur has been, without knowing it, remembering the sea kings of Crete. That the Minoans, silent and buried, were never truly lost at all, because they lived on in myth. And in the myths we can feel, if we listen, the shape of the real history beneath. The mighty sea power, the tribute drawn from weaker lands, the vast and winding palace, the sacred bull and the young who faced it, the great craftsman and his wondrous works, the sudden fall, the escape across the sea. The legend is a memory, distorted by the long centuries as a stone is worn by the sea, but a memory of something that truly was. But a memory is not knowledge, and for 3,000 years, The Minoans were only a shimmer of legend, with no solid ground beneath. It would take the spade of the archaeologist in our own age to turn the myth back into history, to dig into a Cretan hillside and find the labyrinth itself, and give back to the world the real, bright, buried civilization that the legends had remembered all along. To that rediscovery we now, at last, will come. For more than 3,000 years, then, the Minoans lay forgotten beneath the earth of Crete. Their palaces buried in low mounds, their frescoes crumbled in the dark, their very existence unsuspected, remembered only as the shimmer of a myth. The classical Greeks and the Romans after them, and all the long ages that followed, knew nothing of the real civilization that had once ruled their sea. It slept and waited and kept its silence. And then, just over 100 years ago, in the first years of the 20th century, an English archaeologist came to Crete, drawn by old clues and a hunch that something great lay buried there, and began to dig into a low mound near the northern coast, on a site that local tradition and some faint memory associated with an ancient palace. And what he uncovered astonished the world. For out of the earth, as the digging went on, there rose a palace, vast and winding and complex beyond belief. Hundreds of rooms, storerooms lined with great jars, staircases and light wells and columned halls, and upon the walls the frescoes, the dolphins and the lilies, the elegant ladies, the leaping bulls, glowing with color after 3,500 years in the dark. The labyrinth of legend had been found, and it was real. The archaeologist, gazing on the winding halls and the image of the bull and the double axe, remembered the old legend of King Minos, and it was he who gave the lost people the name we call them by ever since, the Minoans, after the legendary sea king in whose labyrinth they had lived on in memory. A whole forgotten civilization, the very first of Europe, stepped out of the earth and back into the knowledge of the world. And what a civilization it proved to be. As the excavations went on at Knossos and across the island, the whole brilliant Minoan world came back into the light. The great palaces, the exquisite frescoes, the marine pottery and the golden jewels, the tiny carved seals, the snake goddesses, the leaping bulls, the whole bright, sea-loving, art-making culture that had flourished before Greece was Greece and been utterly forgotten. The discoverer, in his enthusiasm, went further than many would now approve, rebuilding parts of Knossos in concrete, repainting its frescoes, restoring the palace to something like his vision of its former glory, so that what the visitor sees today is part ancient truth and part modern imagination. But for all the controversy, he had done a great thing. He had given back to humankind a whole lost civilization and turned the labyrinth from a myth into a history. And the work went on and goes on still. Other palaces were dug. Phaistos, Malea, Zakros. The buried town of Akrotiri on Thera was uncovered, with its glowing frescoes and its empty streets. The Minoan script was studied, and the Greek linear be deciphered, though the older linear A keeps its silence yet. Piece by piece, over the past century, the Minoan world has been recovered and studied and come to be loved. Today the ruins of Knossos are among the most visited places in all of Greece, walked each year by people from every corner of the earth, who come to see the labyrinth of legend and to gaze on the leaping bulls and the elegant ladies, and to feel, in that sunlit and haunted place, the presence of the first bright civilization of Europe, brought back from 3,000 years of forgetting. So the myth became history. The legend was proven true, and the Minoans, lost so utterly and remembered only in story, were given back at last their reality, their art, and their rightful place at the very beginning of the European tale. The labyrinth was found again, and within it, not a monster, but a people of extraordinary grace and beauty, waiting 3,500 years to be remembered as they truly were. Let us gather up, then, in the quiet, what these bright island people were, and what they gave to the world. For though they vanished so long ago, their gift is greater than we might think. They were the first great civilization of Europe, the beginning in a real sense of the whole long story that leads down to us. Before Greece and Rome, before all that we call the Western world, there were the Minoans on their green island in the sea. And they set that story off in a lovely key. For the first civilization of Europe was not a thing of grim kings and marching armies and the glorification of war, but of beauty, and the sea, and the joy of the living world. The Minoans painted dolphins and flowers and dancing girls. They ruled the waves by trade rather than terror. They lived, as far as we can tell, in a long and unusual peace, and they made some of the most joyful art the world has ever seen. Their genius flowed on, through the Greeks who inherited it, into the whole civilization of the West, their arts and their crafts and their skills taken up and carried forward, a hidden Minoan thread woven into the fabric of everything that came after. And their memory flowed on too, transformed into the immortal myths of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur and the thread, and perhaps into the dream of drowned Atlantis, living on in the world's imagination for 3,000 years. Their writing, it is true, we still cannot read. Their own voice, in their own tongue, is still silent, locked in the little clay tablets, waiting perhaps for some future key. But we do not altogether need their words to know them. For their painted walls speak clearly enough, across 3,500 years, of who they were. A people who looked upon the sea and the flowers and the leaping bull and the dancing girl, and found the world beautiful, and set that beauty down for us to find. And there is a gentle lesson in their story, too, for those who care to find it, that even the brightest and most fortunate of worlds may be humbled by the sheer power of the earth, that no security is perfect, and no peace is forever, and yet that beauty once made endures, that the frescoes outlasted the fleet and the palace and the whole civilization, and glow still when all the power is dust. What the Minoans made of beauty has outlived all that they made of wealth. So let the bright island world rise once more in your mind, one last time, in all its vanished grace. The red columns of Knossos glowing in the sun, the dolphins arching on the painted walls, the ships crossing the blue sea, the young leapers poised above the horns of the bull, the elegant ladies watching from the terraces, the whole warm, sea-loving, beautiful world of the first civilization of Europe, blazing with life beneath the Cretan sun. And now let it grow quiet and gentle and dim, as the long evening of the centuries settles over it, the columns fading, the sea darkening, the painted walls sinking softly into the sheltering earth, there to sleep and to be kept and to wait through all the long ages for the light of a distant morning. And so we come gently to the close of our long journey through the lost world of the Minoans. And so the first great civilization of Europe sleeps at last beneath the Cretan hills, its painted palaces given back to the light after their long burial. But think of what these bright island people were and what they gave. Before Greece, before Rome, on their green island in the sea, the Minoans built the first of Europe's civilizations, and built it not around grim kings and marching armies, but around beauty and the sea and the sheer joy of a bright and living world. They painted dolphins and lilies and dancing girls where others painted conquest. They ruled the waves so gently that their cities needed no walls. They were, perhaps, the loveliest of all the ancient worlds. And though they vanished, they were never truly lost. Their seacraft and their arts passed to the Greeks who came after, and so, in a quiet and hidden way, flowed on into the whole civilization of the West. And their memory lived on too, transformed, half-dreamed, into some of the most enduring myths the world has ever told. King Minos and his labyrinth, the monster at its heart, the hero and the saving thread, and perhaps, in the great catastrophe that broke them, the very legend of Atlantis, the happy island civilization swallowed by the sea. That, perhaps, is their strangest immortality, that a real people, forgotten so utterly that for thousands of years no one knew they had ever existed, should have lived on all the while at the heart of the world's most famous legends, and that, in our own time, the buried labyrinth should have been found again, and the bright painted world behind the myth given back to us. Their writing, it is true, we still cannot read. Their own voice is still silent. But their painted walls speak, across 3,500 years, of a people who loved life and beauty and the sea. But all of that can wait for the morning. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The warm island sea is dark and calm now. The painted palace is cool and quiet beneath a sky thick with stars. And the long journey of the story has finally come to rest. So let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve. Sleep now and sleep deeply. The old palaces will keep their quiet watch above the sea, as they have for 3,500 years, and another gentle story will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to listen again. Good night.